So what are these two different divergent forms of Bitcoin maximalism?
Okay, so just to go back to kind of reset the observations, right? So developers are coming to Bitcoin, they're coming to Bitcoin fresh, and they're just kind of looking at the code, right? And one of the things that's pretty immediately obvious is the subsidy of Bitcoin declines to zero, right? Because we want 21 million Bitcoins, eventually Bitcoin stop being produced by the protocol, right? So that's kind of assumption one. So assumption two becomes that, as Bitcoin continues to evolve, other people start producing other cryptocurrencies. So developers need to have some sort of stance on like what is happening here and to explain this phenomenon. And so I think initially, as they see this emergence of altcoins, they begin to assume that a couple things. One, that there are useful features on these other chains. And then two, that these other chains are competing for transaction demand with Bitcoin. There's some sort of competitive relationship here. So again, not that we currently believe that, but this was the initial assumption. So really Bitcoin maximalism like 1.0, you sort of have this original idea that kind of takes these two ideas and it makes a new idea with them, right? So in the original Bitcoin maximalism, you have this idea that Bitcoin will be a platform for all kinds of blockchains, all kinds of cryptocurrencies, right? You have this idea that on top of Bitcoin, there'll be many side chains, many types of assets, and you'll be able to use Bitcoin in all these different ways, right? So, and again, you have to kind of trace that back to the assumptions, right? So they're making assumptions about the state of the technology, and then they're designing a solution. So that solution tells us something about the assumptions. So why would you envision a state in which there are many blockchains running on top of Bitcoin unless you are doing that to solve some sort of problem, right? So you kind of take these two things and you kind of look at them and you can say the outcome is equal to this input, right? And the input is they're assuming this problems, and the output is this idea that you would build Bitcoin as a platform, right? That not only is Bitcoin have a fixed monetary supply and a finite asset supply, but it's also a platform. And this is an intrinsically valuable component of Bitcoin that we need to unlock to reach this future state, right? So in Vision 1, you have this idea that Bitcoin will compete with and assimilate these other markets. So as these other markets and other features become valuable, Bitcoin will compete against these platforms and subsume them, right? Mm-hmm. So Bitcoin in this case becomes a platform, is something that you build on top of. What you should notice in describing this is also that this describes a lot of other cryptocurrencies, right? And I think where this article was hard for me because I wrote it in a bunch of different ways, because I think you can explain the subject in a lot of different ways. And one of the other interesting things, in addition to looking at it as there's current Bitcoin maximalism and old Bitcoin maximalism, there's also the cryptocurrency world sort of inherits a lot of these original assumptions about Bitcoin. So the way that I kind of track it is you sort of kind of go back to the original state, right? There's Satoshi, he makes this new thing. Out of this new thing come assumptions, out of these assumptions come solutions, and then over time, we have this divergence of people who still carry on these assumptions or people who have assumed new things, right? So I think the argument here is that, just to distill it, the original version of Bitcoin maximalism was very much based on this idea that Bitcoin was or needed to be competitive with these other markets. It needed to assimilate these other markets. And, ultimately that is not the current version of Bitcoin maximalism that we have today, obviously, because I'm sure nobody on your show recently has come and said anything remotely similar to that, right? Today, we sort of have this idea that, monetary maximalism, I will call it, which is that, Bitcoin is intrinsically valuable. It doesn't compete with any other asset in the world. It's intrinsically valuable. And not only that, because Bitcoin is intrinsically valuable, block space, the network is intrinsically valuable, right? So you're making this assumption now that, or this original state, Bitcoin competed against all these other things and it was destined to outcompete them. And that has changed to Bitcoin does not compete with these other things at all. It will never compete with these other things because it has this inherent demand. It has this special quality, right?
But it does compete because you make a choice between using Bitcoin or gold or fiat. So it does compete.
So this is where it becomes interesting, and the piece is sort of divided on, look, something that's unique about Bitcoin is it is an asset and a network. And the asset is the network. So this was a bit of an exercise into describing there seems to be a large change in the movement towards talking about, describing, and evangelizing about the asset of Bitcoin. But then there is the network. And these two things are synergistic, right? You cannot have a world in which the Bitcoin asset is successful where the network is not successful, which means the network does not operate in an economically viable way. It does not have a means by which it continues to operate. And so you sort of have this question of, okay, if we are on a spectrum where these two things need to exist, have we gone too far into talking only about the asset? And are we under discussing the network and how that network will evolve. And that's the assertion, I think.
What would you define as success for the asset, and what would you define as success for the network?
Well, this is
separately?
what's interesting is I think you have this kind of meta idea, and this is kind of maybe going back into how the different cryptocurrencies look at it, that like we're criticizing the current fiat system because it's unsustainable. That's the claim that literally everybody who's coming on here is making, right? Is the current financial system is unsustainable. But then what is it that makes Bitcoin sustainable? And then you have this idea that Bitcoin needs to be economically viable. That's the only way I've found to describe it. It's very confusing to me why how to phrase this. But it's this idea that after the protocol stops producing Bitcoin needs to continue and someone needs to continue operating, which means the incentives need to hold up under that model, right? There needs to be people who still mine Bitcoin. There needs to be people who pay to send transactions. And ultimately, the system needs to continue into the future. So again, this was sort of an exploration of that uncertainty. And I think what you're starting to find is that the people who are really excited about the asset are starting to say things that people who used to be very excited the network are kind of sort of like, well, hey, that's weird that you're saying that now because we've never thought that before. Again, I'm not trying to say that one of these sides is correct or one of these sides is wrong. I'm just saying they're starting to diverge. So a good example would be some people in the monetary maximalist camp like no longer think that there needs to be very high fees on Bitcoin. That contradicts and starts to unravel a lot of the assumptions the developers have historically made, because the developers are assuming that fees need to be high because they're assuming that mining equals security. And they're assuming that if it costs a low amount to censor transactions, that people will try to do so. Because again, the sort of network maximalist developer type people, they assume that Bitcoin is always under threat. They assume that it is constantly a network that is capable of being subverted. And the asset people seem to think the opposite. They seem to think Bitcoin is this indomitable force that can never be stopped, right? So you have a very drastic difference in sentiment, right? One group believes that Bitcoin is inevitable and invincible on this level that no other asset has been. And this other group sort of says, Bitcoin is essentially always under threat. And at any minute, we need to be constantly on guard for some attack, right? And so those two groups are going to have different assumptions. They're going to have different attitudes because they inherently believe fundamentally very different things, like about the network itself.
I think there are people who are in both camps, though. I believe there are people who think Bitcoin is inevitable, but it isn't invincible.
Right. So I think this.
But sorry, just to add to that. But I do think some of the people who think it's inevitable are hyperbolic and don't spend enough time considering the threats,
right,
or what will happen. So the one thing I just discussed with CK is, sorry, Danny, you're gonna have to put these sequentially out, is that he talks about Bitcoin's inevitability and it being binary. It either becomes the global standard for money, or it fails and dies. And I'm like, in my own mind, I'm like, no, I don't see it binary. It may never become the global standard for money, but it may be a tool that is useful for people. It may have a role similar to gold. It may be a network whereby you use it to transfer value, but it isn't the global standard for money. I don't know, but I don't think it's binary.
Well, this is the thing is I think the temptation of us as humans is to apply narratives to Bitcoin. So one of the things that, look, I've been a journalist in here since 2013. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is,
You're basically our only journalist. So maybe you and Aaron Van Weerden.
Yeah. Yes, Aaron is very talented and looking forward to his future work. But, the way that these cycles develop, what happens is, the only thing we can say about Bitcoin is it's going up in value over time, right? But, when you get into these sort of cycles, we sort of start serving these narratives and building these narratives around Bitcoin. And then we start thinking as humans that these narratives are important for Bitcoin. Are they? Because it seems to be that these past cycles, people have built entire narratives around Bitcoin that no longer exist or no longer useful and that people no longer believe. So then is that also true of the current narratives we're spinning? So I think again, just to go back to what you were saying about, I think there are people in both camps. I think this article was really just an attempt to, I think what's been frustrating to people when reading it is I think nobody really fits into one camp or the other. But I'm trying to describe here is a difference in biases. That essentially there are, if Bitcoin is a union of these two things, you can sort of see that if you tilt one way, you end up with this sort of assumption suite, and if you tilt this other way, you end up with these other assumptions, right? And I think that what is helpful in that is that we can start to tease out some of these things. So to your point about what is Bitcoin's ultimate destiny, Bitcoin only has to be economically viable. It only has to continue. does not really need our narratives. It doesn't really need us, making any sort of thing about it. It needs to have enough demand and use like to continue in the future for the people to continue operating it, because it is a decentralized system ultimately.